Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, I'm Anggraini. This video was taken to fulfill the task of research and development in ELT subject. So let's take the time to watch this video. According to Oxford Dictionary, experiment is a scientific procedure undertaken to make a discovery, test a hypothesis, or demonstrate a known fact. When do you use an experiment? You use an experiment when you want to establish possible cause and effect between your independent and dependent variables. This means that you attempt to control all variables that influence the outcome except for the independent variable. Then, when the independent variable influences the dependent variable, we can say the independent variable caused or probably caused the dependent variable. For example, if you compare one group that experiences a lecture and another group that experiences discussion, you control all of the factors that make influence the outcome of high score on a quiz. You make sure that personal abilities and test conditions are the same for both groups, and you give both groups the same question. You control for all variables that make influence the outcome except for the difference in types of instruction, lecture, or discussion. You also use an experiment when you have two or more groups to study, as in this lecture versus discussion example. When did experiments develop? In an experiment, you test an idea or practice or procedure to determine whether it influences an outcome or dependent variable. You first decide on an idea with which to experiment, assign individuals to experience it, and have some individual experience something different, and then determine whether those who experience it, the idea or practice or procedure, performed better on some outcome than those who did not experience it. What are key characteristics of experiments? Before you consider how to conduct an experiment, you will find it helpful to understand in more depth several key ideas central to experimental research. These ideas are: first is random assignment. Random assignment is the process of assigning individuals at random to groups or to different groups in an experiment. The experimental terms for this process is equating the groups. Equating the groups means that the researcher randomly assigns individuals to groups and equally distributes any variability of individuals between or among the groups or conditions in the experiment. The second is control over extraneous variables. Extraneous factors are any influences in the selection of participants, the procedures, the statistics, or design likely to affect the outcome and provide an alternative explanation for our result than what we expected. All experiments have some random error where the scores do not reflect the true scores of the population that you can control. But you can try to control extraneous factors as much as possible. Other control procedures you can use both before and during the experiments are: first is pre-test and post-test, second is covariate, the third is matching of participants, and the fourth is homogeneous sample and blocking variables. The third is manipulation of treatment condition. In experimental treatment, the researcher cyclically intervenes to alter the condition experienced by the experimental unit. For example, a reward for good spelling performance or a special type of classroom instruction, such as small group discussion. The experimental researchers manipulates one or more of the treatment variable condition. In other words, in an experiment, the researcher cyclically intervenes or manipulates with intervention in one or more condition so that individuals experience something different in the experimental condition than in the control condition. This means that to conduct an experiment, you need to be able to manipulate at least one condition of an independent variable. It is easy to identify some situation in which you might measure an independent variable and obtain categorical data but not be able to manipulate one of the conditions. Next is outcome measures. In experiments, the outcome or response criterion or post-test is the dependent variable that is the presumed effect of the treatment variable. It is also the effect predicted in a hypothesis in the cause and effect equation. For example, of dependent variable in experiments might be: first is achievement scores on a criterion reference test, and the second is test scores on an aptitude test. Next is group comparison. A group comparison is the process of a researcher obtaining scores for individuals or groups on the dependent variable and comparing the means and variance both within the group and between the groups. The next is threats to validity. A final idea in experiments is to design them so that the inferences you draw are true or correct. So, threats to drawing these correct inferences need to be addressed in experimental research. Our discussion here will focus on the two primary threats to consider. First is internal validity and the second is external validity. Threats to internal validity are problems in drawing correct inferences about whether the goal variation. In other words, the variation in one variable contributes to the variation in other variable. Between the presumed treatment variable and the outcome reflects as causal relationship. The second is threats to external validity. Threats to external validity are problems that threaten our ability to draw correct inferences from the sample data to other persons, settings, treatment variables, and measures. According to Cook and Campbell 1979, three threats might affect this generalizability. First is interaction of selection and treatment, second is interaction of setting and treatment, and the last is interaction of history and treatment. So, the next is, what are the types of experimental design? The most common design you will find in educational research are: first, between group design. So between group design, it's include about three aspects. First is through experiments, second is quasi-experiment, and the last is factorial design. So for through experiments, pre and post test. In true experiments, the researchers randomly assign participants to different conditions of the experimental variable. One variation on this design is to obtain pre-test as well as post-test measure or observation. When experimenters collect pre-test scores, they may compare net scores. The differences between the pre and post-test when true experiments include only a post-test, it reduces the threats of testing, instrumentation, and regression because you do not use a pre-test. If a pre-test is used, it introduces all of these factors as possible threats to validity. Instrumentation exists as a potential threat in most experiments, but if your researchers use the same or similar instrument for the pre and poster or enact standard procedures during the study, you should instrumentation threats to a minimum. Second is quasi-experiments. For quasi-experiments include assignment but not random assignment of participants to groups. This is because the experimenter cannot artificially create groups for the experiments. For example, studying a new math program might require using existing fourth-grade classes and designating one as the experimental group and one as the control group. The quasi-experimental approach introduces considerable more threats to internal validity than the true experiment, because the investigator doesn't randomly assign participants to groups. The potential threats of maturation, selection, mortality, and the interaction of selection with other threats are possibilities. The third is factorial design. Factorial design represents a modification of the between-group design in which the researcher studies two or more categorical independent variables, each assignment at two or more levels, according to Fogg 2005. The purpose of this design is to study the independent and simultaneous effect of two or more independent treatment variables on an outcome. The next is within group or individual design. Single individual or within individual design. This type of design assumes several forms. First is time series, second is repeated measures, and the last is single subject design. So for time series experiment, a time series design consists of studying one group over time with multiple pre-test and post-test measure or observation made by the researcher. This design doesn't require access to large number of participants, and it requires only one group for the study. It is ideal for examining change in entire system, for example, a school district, where it would be difficult to find a control group or system willing to cooperate. However, this design is labor-intensive because the researcher needs to gather multiple measures. The second is repeated measure experiments. Another experimental design that has the advantage of employing only a single group is a repeated measure design. In repeated measure design, all participants in a single group participate in all experimental treatments, with each group becoming its own control. The researcher compares a group's performance under one experimental treatment with its performance under another experimental treatment. The experimenter designs all multiple treatments as in factorial design, but administers each separately to only one group. After each administration, the researcher obtains a measure or observations. The last is single subject experiments. So for single subject research, also called N of one research, behavior analysis, or within subject research, involves the study of single individuals, the observation over baseline period, and the administration of an intervention. This is followed by another observation after the intervention to determine if the treatment affects the outcome. For example, in one single subject study, the researcher tests whether elementary students with learning disabilities achieve better if they monitor their own task behavior, according to Colleague 1997. Single subject research has the advantage of providing data on single individuals, such as the learning and behaviors of children with disabilities, where a person-by-person analysis is needed. It also controls for many threats to internal validity.